Okay, we'll go ahead and get started tonight. Thank you all for being here. Glad to see you and glad to have you with us. Tonight we're going to be diving in to just I was just telling Mike, just 2 weeks is really all I'm planning on doing on a little bit of the story of Jonathan from the book of 1 Samuel. Jonathan is an interesting study, and there's more to his life and to his study than we'll get to, but we're going to do a good bit of reading tonight from 1 Samuel 14, and then next week we'll do a good bit of reading from 1 Samuel 20, and I think next week's conversation will be much more familiar to most of us, thinking about the events that happen in that chapter, but what we're going to read tonight is really interesting and kind of gives us a little bit of insight into Jonathan and into what's going on at this particular moment in Israel's history. But before we dive in and start talking about this and reading, I thought I would kind of give you an idea of what to expect beyond these 2 weeks. On October the 9th, which is, if you include tonight, it's the third Wednesday night from now, so we'll have 2 Wednesdays of Jonathan, and then October the 9th, we're going to have an all-church prayer night. Right in here. We did this last year, and we had, during the fall, we had an all-church prayer night in here, had some singing as well, and so we'll invite the other classes that are meeting. The youth will be joining us, and we'll have an all-church prayer night in here and enjoy getting to do that and pray together as a family. And as part of that also, since this year's an election year and we're coming up right on that time, we'll also include in that night some dedicated time to pray for our country and for the election process and everything that goes on there. So please make plans to be here that night. If there are others that sometimes are here on Wednesday night that you want to encourage to be here, or if there are others that usually aren't here on Wednesday nights that you want to encourage to be here, would love to have folks here for that. And then after that, speaking of election season, Josh Ross shared with us last summer when he was here for his summer speaker series that he was working on some material to do with how Christians should live during an election season. And he released a short book. It's about 100 pages. We're not going to necessarily study his book, but we're going to use it kind of as a launching point to talk about how to live as Christians in an election season. And so after that night of prayer on the 9th, we'll spend a couple weeks leading up to the election here on Wednesday nights talking about that together, and we'll encourage y'all to be here for that and to join in that conversation as well, and to think about how we can be effective witnesses for Christ when the world kind of goes crazy for a couple weeks during election season. So hopefully that'll be a beneficial conversation for all of us, myself included, right? So looking forward to getting to do that. Okay, tonight, like I said, we're going to be talking about Jonathan, the son of King Saul. Saul was the first king over Israel. And so just to kind of remind us of where this is taking place in the Old Testament and in Israel's history, the people of Israel have entered into the Promised Land. They've been there for a number of generations, years. They've had these judges that have kind of ruled over parts of Israel and parts of the Promised Land for a number of years, and now they've gotten to this point where they would like to have a more centralized authority as a people. They would like to have a king reigning over them, and so they've asked Samuel, who is the last judge of the people of Israel, to provide for them a king. And so Samuel anoints this guy with God's help named Saul, and Saul looks the part of a king. That's one of the things that the writers of 1st and 2nd Samuel that they really want to make clear to us is that Saul looks like he's a king. But if you remember much of Saul's life, you'll remember that Saul has some pretty significant highs and some pretty significant lows in that process as well. And so Saul becomes king over Israel, and he begins this campaign of fighting against Israel's enemies, particularly against the Philistines, the Amalekites, all these different people groups that they were commanded when they entered into the Promised Land to make sure that they were pushed out, sometimes even killed entirely from the Promised Land. And yet it looks like Israel is commingling in the Promised Land with these different groups of people. And so Saul begins this campaign of war against them, and that's where we're going to kind of pick up in our story today in 1 Samuel 14. Is there's this ongoing battle between the Israelites and the Philistines, and we'll kind of see what happens there. When Israel asks for this king and when Saul gets installed over the land of Israel, what the people are looking for is somebody who can help maintain control and provide peace for the land and also to help them enter into a time of prosperity. But what God warns the people about these kings over Israel is that if they install a king, that in addition to the hopes for peace and prosperity and all those things, that they're also going to have to give the king what he wants. And so we're going to see that at work tonight in our story a little bit, that Saul has this idea at work in his life that whatever he says goes, and that he is uniquely has opportunity to take what's his and to claim things for his own. And so we'll see that at work in our story tonight as well. And really what I want to do tonight is focus primarily on Jonathan, but we're gonna have a little bit of time to compare and contrast Saul and Jonathan as well, because they have a lot of similarities, but they also have some significant differences. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to enter into our story tonight, 1 Samuel chapter 14, and the people of Israel are in this conflict with the Philistines. Jonathan is the prince, he's the son of Saul, and Saul has this entitlement to him. He has this, he's pretty impulsive in a lot of his decisions. And so I want us to read a little bit. We'll stop and pause a couple of times as we read through this chapter and talk. But as we read, I want you to notice also those similarities and differences that you notice between Saul and Jonathan, and just kind of see if there's anything that's worth mentioning or that we talk about here tonight together. So let's read together 1 Samuel chapter 14, starting in verse 1. It says, "One day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, 'Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side.' But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron, and with him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was a son of Ichabod's brother, Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, and no one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was named Bozez, and the other Sinah. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, the other to the south toward Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, 'Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few.' 'Do all that you have in mind,' his armor-bearer said. 'Go ahead. I'm with you, heart and soul.' Jonathan said, 'Come on then. We'll cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, "Wait there until we come to you," we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, "Come up to us," we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands.' So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. 'Look,' said the Philistines, 'the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in.' The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, 'Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson.' So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, 'Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel.' Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. And the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre." Okay, we'll pause there and discuss what's going on here for just a moment. But do you see this scene in your mind's eye? Do you see what's going on here? You've got these armies that are opposed to one another. The Philistines, it appears, have the high ground. They've got the strategically advantageous points locked down, and so their insult to the Israelites is that they're climbing out of their holes. It appears that the Israelites are hiding from the Philistines because they're at a disadvantage of just where people are located, where these armies are located. And so you've got Saul who's sitting with his men. They're waiting perhaps for a sign or an opportunity to move forward, to advance, and they're described as kind of passive in this story. They're not making much action. They're not doing much. But then you have Jonathan. And earlier I mentioned that Saul can be quite impulsive. And I think this is one of those similarities that we see between Saul and Jonathan. And we'll continue to see it as we read tonight. But I think Saul has a little bit of that impulsive nature I think Jonathan has that impulsive nature to him as well. And so right off the bat, he tells his armor bearer, hey, let's essentially go pick a fight. Let's go exploring and see if we can't deliver a victory for our army. And so we have this whole scene play out. How many of us tonight, this is a story that once we read it, is kind of familiar to us? Anybody, is this something that sounds kind of familiar? Maybe a handful. It's kind of a lesser known story, I think, from this time of Israel's history. And certainly the next story that we'll read is really kind of bizarre and maybe even less well known. But I think it's especially important for us to notice here as we're reading through this, if we're going to compare and contrast some things about Saul and Jonathan, that Jonathan appears ready for action, he appears ready to do something, while Saul appears passive, and he doesn't appear like he's ready to do much as this story moves along. I do want to point out, just as I mentioned that as well, that if we were to say that Jonathan is doing the right thing because he is ready for action, and Saul's doing the wrong thing because he's passive, I don't know that that's always a truth that we want to apply in any situation, right? I think we've probably all known people who are quicker to respond, and they maybe do some things poorly or incorrectly because they respond so quickly they might not fully understand what's going on. Whereas those who maybe sometimes sit back and wait until they gather all the information end up making a wiser choice in life. Is this ringing true for us? So I don't want to say that just because Jonathan is ready to jump into action, that means that he's right, and that always jumping into action without sometimes evaluating what's going on, sometimes that can be a good course of action to take as well. And so I don't want to make it seem like always jumping in and just diving in head first is always the right thing to do. Mike?
How old do you think he is right at this time?
Yeah, we're not really given much of a description of ages. He's old enough to be a fighting man. And so he's old enough to join the army, and he's old enough to make this decision on his own to go off and battle the Philistines, which you could say is maybe a young, impulsive drive, maybe a late teenager, early 20s, something like that. But we don't really know quite how old he is in this.
I think two things. I think the story is very much like David and Goliath, with Jonathan being like David. And the way he's like David and not like Saul is he says, the Lord can save us, whether it's by one or by many.
Yes.
And Saul, which is very much like David's attitude about Goliath. On the other hand, Saul's attitude is it's all about Saul.
That's right.
And what he can do, and he doesn't always wait for the Lord. In fact, in this story, he doesn't wait to hear a word of the Lord before he acts.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's a really critical piece to this puzzle. What Randy said was that Jonathan recognizes that it doesn't matter if there's a few or a lot in this army, that if the Lord is with them, that they've already won the battle. And so Jonathan has this recognition of spiritual reality that Saul doesn't appear to have in the story. Saul doesn't appear to be ready or looking for any kind of spiritual guidance in this, at least in the way that the story reads for us today. And yet, he's the one who's sitting there with a priest. Like, the text gives us a pretty obvious clue of who is sitting there with Saul. It's this descendant of Eli. And so Saul has access, supposedly, to God and doesn't recognize it, whereas Jonathan, he seems to have grasped this spiritual truth that if God's with us, we've already won.
And as soon as Saul realizes that a word from God might inhibit his tactical advantage, it occurs because Jonathan and his armor bearer have the Philistines on the run.
Mm-hmm.
He tells the priest to stop what you're doing.
That's right.
And then he goes on the attack when he thinks the Philistines are always on the run.
Yeah. So let's talk about Jonathan's tactic here for a second. Jonathan comes up with this crazy idea, and I think it highlights what Randy's pointing out to us already tonight. He comes up with this crazy tactic, and the idea is if we show ourselves to the Philistines, so they're doing away with the element of surprise. They're not going to make this a surprise attack against the Philistines. So they're doing away with that potential advantage. And then Jonathan tells his armor bearer, if they say, stay where you're at, we'll come to you, we'll stay here, but essentially that will be a sign that God's not with us in this fight. And if you think about this from a strategy point of view, what Jonathan is basically saying is if the playing field is level, if we're on equal terms, we're going to lose. God's not with us. But if they tell us to come up to them, which means that we're going to have to climb this cliff, that means that God's with us, which from a military strategy perspective is the exact opposite of what would be true, right? So the Philistines can be standing there comfortably and ready to attack these guys who are climbing up hands and feet without weapon in their hand, and yet the text reads that the Philistines fall before them and they slay their enemies. And so I love this what the text is highlighting for us about Jonathan and his armor bearer is that what Jonathan is telling his armor bearer is the only way we're going to win this is if God's involved. And the way that we're going to recognize whether God's involved is if we have no advantage whatsoever, that means that God is with us. Which is absolutely if we're being honest, this is a really dumb idea, right? Like Jonathan is being, from a worldly perspective, like this is going to lead to his death and his armor bearer's death. Israel is going to be without a prince here in just a few moments. But he's got this trust in God. And because he has this trust in God, he says, if all the odds are against us, they've got more men, they've got the better position, and they know that we're coming, that means that God will hand them over to us. And so what I want us to think about when it comes to this is how are we preparing ourselves to trust God even if there's no reason for us to do so? And I think that's an important question for us to ask in the world that we're living in currently as we continue to see our world move more and more from a Christian perspective, a Christian worldview. The idea of following Christ in this world is going to become less and less wise in the eyes of the world. And so how are we, as followers of Jesus, preparing ourselves to trust Jesus in those situations where it looks like it's incredibly stupid to do so? It looks like the most foolish thing that we can do. And so I want us to be paying attention to that in this story and in our lives here. So let's keep going and see what happens next. Randy's kind of hinted at what takes place next. After they begin this, essentially this rout of the Philistines, they've killed 20 Philistines in half an acre, and now God is going to show up in an even greater way. So let's pick up in verse 15.
Hey, Jake.
Yes.
This is, I forget the whole timeline of 1 Samuel, but this is kind of our introduction to John.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what in the world has been happening in his life that even think God works this way?
Yeah.
What would he have been privy to or seen previously in his life that makes him pick this day?
That's right. Yeah.
Because it's just this 50-50 thing. It's just like us doing the same thing outside today. Like today, God's not going to let me make a bad decision. He's going to show me, like, where'd that come from?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Ever in his lifetime? I mean, had he seen God work that way in the world?
Yeah, and it's especially interesting when you compare it to, as we keep reading and learning more about Saul and his life, he doesn't have this great example at home, right? Saul, we got to give Saul a little bit of credit. Saul gets it right sometimes, but Saul gets it wrong a lot. And so it's not like he's got this incredible example of somebody who's showing him and teaching him and training him. He's got this dad who's messed up and who doesn't know how to pay attention for God's voice. He doesn't know how to listen for God. And yet, like you're saying, like what is it that has given him this level of trust in the Lord and in what God can do for him? And so, maybe it's the story of his people that has come before. Maybe these judges, this time of the judges that they're coming out of. Maybe he looks back at some of these heroes from the judges. Of course, kind of the point of the book of Judges is also that the longer the book goes, the worse things get. And so you really have to go back even further than the judges because they're just as messed up as Saul is. But maybe it's just the story of God's people, that he's been watching and learning about the history of Israel and his people and says, the God who showed up to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who led us out of Egypt, like a long time ago, that's the God who is still our God today.
Well, that makes this even a more pivotal moment in the Old Testament than really.
Yeah,
It's God showing back up in a very direct way.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. Thank you, David. All right, let's pick up in verse 15 and see what happens next. Okay, so they've just routed 20 of the Philistines, and it says, then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. And Saul said to the men who were with him, muster the forces and see who has left us. When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God. At that time it was with the Israelites. And while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven. Okay, so again, highlighting what we're talking about so far, Saul appears again to be passive. He's slow to enter into this battle. He has essentially an accounting done of who is present and who's missing. He finds out the two people who are missing, and even still, he's slow to enter into this battle. The Lord shows up in this mighty way. The Philistines are fleeing in every direction, and finally he tells Ahijah, this descendant of Eli, the priest, hey, stop talking to me about what God's doing because clearly God's doing something that you're not noticing and recognizing. And so they join in the battle, and it's a big victory for Israel and for Israel's people. And that last verse, especially verse 23, highlights that it's the Lord who has done this. So it's not the military strength, it's not the army, it's the Lord who is the one who is saving Israel and her people. And so just like I mentioned a few seconds ago, here's our question to take from this first part of the chapter in chapter 14. The question is, am I ready to trust and serve the Lord even when it looks foolish to do so? And I'll add on to that, how am I preparing myself to do that? It doesn't happen by accident. I think we've got to prepare ourselves to do that. And so how am I preparing myself to trust the Lord in those moments where it looks like the Philistines have all the advantages? It looks like the world is completely moving a different direction than the way of Jesus. How am I preparing myself? How am I trusting in the Lord to lead me even when it looks foolish to do so? Anybody? I don't want to skip over it. Anybody want to respond to that question?
What kind of a situation would that come up? When would it be foolish to not trust in the Lord?
Well, okay, yeah, let me clarify that, I guess. From our perspective, for those of us in this room who have chosen to follow Jesus, there's never a time that it's foolish to follow Jesus, right? But from a worldly perspective, if the world looks at a situation and says, oh, you can't love those enemies, you can't treat them with kindness and respect and dignity, that's foolish. That'd be crazy to go the extra mile. That'd be crazy to give generously in that situation. Is that making more sense? So from a worldly perspective, when it looks foolish to follow Christ, how are we preparing ourselves to still answer yes, like we have chosen to do as followers of Jesus? Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, it should never, from our perspective, it should never be foolish to choose to follow Jesus. That's good.
I'd also say none of us in this room are ready to serve like Jonathan did.
Yeah.
I mean, because Jonathan put a task to the Lord I won't use the word random, but obviously none of this is random. But I don't know if Jonathan just did that in every decision point in his life, and so God had been instilling this confidence in him. It's like any major life decision acceptable alternatives out there of action. And if it happens one way, well, it must have been God, and that's the way you're going to go.
Yeah.
And I don't know if any of us operate with that level of faith.
Yeah. And just like you're asking along the lines of this, is how did Jonathan get to this this idea that if they tell us to come up, that means that God is with us? Like, how did he come to that discovery? I don't know if it was a word from God that he received. I don't know if it was just this blind trust that he had from the story that we were talking about a few minutes ago. But yeah, it's like when he came up with this test, it wasn't a very good test. You know, go back to the book of Judges. Gideon's test is better than Jonathan's test. You know, if the fleece is wet, that means, and the ground is dry. Like, there's no stakes in that, right? Like, my life is not on the line. Gideon's test looks a lot more sensible. Jonathan's test is going to cost him his life if he's wrong, and yet he's right. And God honors, I think, that he had that level of trust in him.
I think the Lord's going to be with them regardless.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, regardless of the outcome. Yeah. Good. Okay. We have mentioned, or I've mentioned, I guess, I've mentioned that I think both Jonathan and Saul are impulsive by nature, and certainly that's going to be what we see take place as the chapter progresses here. So let's pick up and keep reading in verse 24. It says, "Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food before the evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies.' So none of the troops tasted food." Okay, so there's our impulsive decision by Saul for the chapter. "The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. And when they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out. Yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand, and he dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, 'Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food today. That's why the men are faint." And Jonathan said, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater?" Okay, pause for just a minute. Let's talk about this oath here for just a second. Saul and Jonathan have a pretty significant disagreement here, although not to one another. But this is another interesting difference that we're seeing between Saul and Jonathan here. Yeah, it could be a typical father-son rivalry, right? But Saul's made this decision that basically, nothing should be more important to us than defeating our enemies today, not even eating food. And so he puts this oath, this curse upon his army that if they eat anything, that they will be cursed. And Jonathan unknowingly eats something, and he has this disagreement, and he tells the soldiers that his father has caused trouble for the people because that he's made this decision and kind of forced all of the people into this. Some Bibles may say, when it says that Jonathan's eyes brightened, it may say that instead of his eyes brightening, it may say something along the lines of his strength was renewed or something like that. And so if you're kind of wondering what's this image of the eyes brightening mean, it just kind of means that like maybe the color returned back to him or something like that, and his strength is returning to him because his stomach is not empty. And so let's pick up and keep reading verse 31. Yeah.
The thing that strikes me there, we're talking about the difference between Saul and Jonathan. What struck me in that oath was Saul calling down this curse on his own people when he has avenged his enemies himself. I mean, it's all about Saul.
Yeah.
And my enemies. It's not the Lord's enemies. It's not the enemies of Israel. It's not the people that are opposed to God. It's the people that are opposed to him.
Yeah.
Himself. And so his selfishness and his self-centeredness is becoming more and more evident as time goes by. This is just another example. And Jonathan was so selfless in his oath that he took to go up there, and he's going to follow whatever the Lord tells him to do.
Yeah.
And go and avenge the Lord's enemies. And this is all about Saul.
Yeah, that's right. And we're going to see the problem at the end of this chapter that it creates because it's about to cost Saul and Jonathan dearly. And so we'll see that here in just a couple of verses. Let's give Saul some credit. What happens next is to his credit rather than to take away from him. So verse 31, it says, that day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines, excuse me, the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You've broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. Then he said, go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord, and it was the first time that he had done this. Okay, so Saul does something mostly good here. He stops his people, his army, from eating the blood of the animals that they're eating. This goes all the way back to the law of Moses in the first, the book of Leviticus, where God commands his people not to eat an animal that has blood in it. They're supposed to first drain the blood out before they eat the meat. And so the people are doing this, and Saul stops it. He puts an end to it, and he even builds an altar to the Lord. And so I do want to recognize that there is this desire within Saul to serve the Lord. He's going to get it wrong more often than he gets it right. But it mentions here that he builds an altar to the Lord. He has this worshipful attitude after they've defeated their enemies. He's ready for his men to finally eat and to receive their strength back. And he wants them to go about it the right way. And so he stops them from sinning against the Lord in this way, and he tries to get them back on track. And yet, we also know that Saul has this selfish streak within him, that even the times that he receives a direct commandment from the Lord or from Samuel as the Lord's representative, he's going to alter it for his own sake, for his own benefit, to make it easier for him or for his men. And so we'll see that in the coming chapters and talk about that perhaps a little bit next week when we get back to talking about the events there.
Hey, Jay,
Yes?
is this kind of I'm not so sure about Jonathan's behavior here. So, I mean, he kind of undermined his father
Yeah.
and spoke against him and basically said, oh, don't listen to him, go eat whatever you want to eat.
Yeah. So I think between the two sections that we read, I think we've got to understand that there's an entire battle in between that. So it could be the case that he's saying it, and as a result of him saying that, in the moment when they're in the woods, the people fall on the animals and just start eating them. But I think there's also time that passes in there as well. So, but at the same time, I don't want to paint Jonathan as the saint who's perfect, because he's fallible and he's human just like the rest of us. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and here he is, not only his father but the king, and he's telling the king's army, "Hey, my dad made a bad choice. He shouldn't have done that." And so he is undermining his father by doing that.
It's interesting that the writer of 1 Samuel draws our attention to the fact that Saul, who is a man old enough to have an adult son, this is the first time he built an altar.
Yeah,
to God.
that's right.
And perhaps it wouldn't have been mentioned unless the author of 1 Samuel thought it was significant.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm gonna especially want to highlight this after the next the last section of the text that we're going to read for tonight. But I don't think Saul knows how to listen to the Lord's voice, and we see from the very beginning of this chapter that Jonathan does. Jonathan has either trained himself or he's found a way to listen for the Lord's voice, and Saul has never done that in his life. He doesn't know how to listen to God. And so for us, I think that should be a particularly potent statement for us, that we want to be more like Jonathan in that regard. We want to be people who know how to listen to God and know to listen for God, and not people who go their entire life without figuring out how to do that. Let's keep reading verse 36, and we'll read through verse 45, and that'll be the end of what we're reading today. So thank you all for sticking with us with a lot of reading tonight. It says, Saul said, "Let's go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them until dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive. And do whatever seems best to you," they replied. But the priest said, "Let us inquire of God here." So Saul asked God, "Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer him that day. Saul therefore said, "Come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let's find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." Okay, so there's again some impulsive words by King Saul here. But not one of them said a word. Saul then said to all the Israelites, "You stand over there, I and Jonathan my son will stand over here." "Do what seems best to you," they replied. And so Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, "Why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim, but if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim." Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul said, "Cast the lot between me and Jonathan my son," and Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you've done." So Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." And Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." And so the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Okay, here in just a few minutes, we're going to have a discussion about the Urim and the Thummim. If you've never heard of that before, we'll talk about that in just a second. But just think of the situation that Saul has. He's worked himself into a corner here, and he at first separates the leaders of his army from he and his son, I think, thinking it's going to be over there, and we're going to be in the clear, only to find out that the lots that are cast fall on he and his son. And so then he says, "Okay, well, there's only two of us, so let's find out which one of it is." And he finds out it's his son, Jonathan. And he says, may I be the recipient of this curse if you don't die, Jonathan. And so he's willing to have his son, lose his son, over this oath that he's made that Jonathan has already highlighted to his men. Dad never should have done that. That was foolish of him to do that. And so this drama, this saga is going on, and we find out that Jonathan confesses his sin, and I love what Jonathan does here because it's the exact opposite of what I would expect. Rather than begging for his life, rather than trying to do what Saul, I think, would probably do, which is to try to save his own skin, Jonathan says, if that's what God's will is, then may it be done to me that way. Again, I think wanting to highlight that idea that he is aware of God's will, and he's willing to go with God's will even if it costs him his life. He's already displayed that for us in the very first section that we read tonight. And so if this is God's will, if I did the wrong thing, if I've sinned against the Lord, then may it happen to me, the way that Saul has said. I do want to highlight also, we're talking about 1 Samuel tonight, but I can't help but with all this talk about oaths, jump to Jesus for just a second. When Jesus gets a chance to tell us about how we ought to use our speech and how we ought to use oaths, he says that we shouldn't even need to make an oath because we should be people who are so honest and people of integrity that if we say yes, we mean yes, and if we say no, we mean no. And there shouldn't have to be an oath thrown on there that says, if it happens this way, then Jonathan has to die, because we should just be able to say yes, and people know that that's what we mean. So I'm just going to skip to Jesus for a moment and say, be trustworthy people, okay? That's what Jesus tells us. Say what you mean, and maybe even weigh your words before you say them to make sure that you mean them the way that you say them. Did I say that right? Good, okay. Okay, let's talk about the Urim and the Thummim for just a second. I threw up a picture here. This is not what they actually look like. This is a recreation, a representation, a picture of somebody who made this for today. So this is not what they would have looked like, but it gives you an image to look at. The text on it is Hebrew, and it's just the word Urim and the word Thummim. So the black one is Urim, and the white one is Thummim. And so the translation for these, really it's more of an interpretation rather than a direct translation of these Hebrew words. But Urim gets interpreted as light or as doctrine, and Thummim as revelation or truth. And essentially what the people are saying there is that these two stones, these lots that are cast, that they are essentially going to reveal truth. They're going to tell us what's going on. And so these would be used in Israel in essentially either or scenarios, yes, no type questions, and they were meant to be a way of revealing God's will. And so there was trust that if they cast these particular lots, that God would have them come out in a way that revealed God's will, that told us what the truth of the situation was. And so 1 Samuel 14 gives us a really good example. They get mentioned in the Pentateuch, in the book of Deuteronomy, but we don't really get an example. 1 Samuel 14 really kind of shows us how they were used in Israel. And essentially the priest, that we were talking about Aijalon earlier, he would carry them in this ephod, this garment that he would wear, and he'd have these two stones with him. That way, if they needed to inquire something of the Lord, they would have that option available to them. And so Saul does this, and he finds out his son is guilty. And this is Saul's primary way in this story of listening for God's guidance. But notice at the end of the story that the lots are cast, Jonathan is found out to be guilty, Saul thinks it's going to lead to his son's death. Jonathan is humble enough to go along with it and to say, if this is God's will, then may it happen to me that way. And the people intervene and say, surely this is not God's will, because it's actually Jonathan. The only person today who's actually heard anything from the Lord is Jonathan. And so the people intervene and they stop it from happening, because it's not these two stones in this story that tell us the will of God. It's Jonathan is the one who's paying attention and who's able to understand what God's will is in this story. Okay, so we've been talking about this from Saul and Jonathan's perspective. I want to pull it to our perspective here in just a second, but Ellison, give me a comment real fast.
So I just wondered, why do you think that, I guess, Saul was willing to say something so extreme that, well, since the Lord did not respond to us, that means whoever is responsible for that has to die. So I was wondering, because, that's a very extreme consequence per se. So, so why did he say something that big as opposed to just something that could have been much smaller?
Yeah, the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime. And so I think what's going on here is because he's put a curse on his soldiers. And I think there's probably a little bit of a fear that if he doesn't follow through on this curse, that the curse will fall on him then. And so, I put a curse on you, but if I kind of go back on my word because it's my son, I'm going to be the one who ends up suffering as a result. And so I think it's because he has set the terms of this curse, and he is not willing to bear the consequences himself. And so I think that's what's going on here, is he's afraid that if he doesn't follow through with his son, that he's going to somehow receive the punishment for that curse that he put on his people. Anybody else want to add to that or something? Randy?
In my opinion, the curse that Saul put on his army not to eat or drink was inherently flawed. And it was inherently flawed because he said, I don't want you to eat or drink until I have revenged myself on my enemies.
Yeah.
The curse was all about Saul.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't about Israel as a nation. It wasn't about God's will. It was all about Saul.
Yeah.
And that's flawed. And I think that's why God inspired the men of Israel to rise up and say, you aren't going to kill Jonathan.
That's right.
Because as you said, they recognized that Jonathan was the only one listening to and hearing the voice of God.
Yeah. Okay, so two questions for us. We're spilling over time. I apologize. I'll get us out of here quickly here. But a couple questions for us tonight. Number one is, how do you listen for God's guidance? And I think that's an important question for us to wrestle with a little bit, reflect on. I know the answers that we're trained to give, prayer, reading scripture. I know those answers, right? But I think there's also other ways that we can listen for God. I think there's other ways that we do listen for God. And maybe even more dangerously, my next question is, what else are we listening to for guidance in this world? Because I think Jonathan displays some humility in this story and some singular focus on the will of God. He's willing to trust God, even though it makes no sense to do so, even though we're not quite sure how he got to that decision. But the Lord is the one who he's trusting with his life. Saul is trusting in his own power, his own selfishness, his own army. He's trusting in these Urim and Thummim stones to reveal God's truth and revelation to him. And he hasn't ever inquired of God and gotten an answer in the whole story. And so how are we paying attention for God's guidance? And is there something else that's competing with us searching for God's guidance in our world? And then I want to mention this too about Jonathan. There's more that I could say here about this, but I've already mentioned that I think he displayed some humility here. And so I would say that humility is also a necessary element to a life of discipleship. We've got to have humility in order to listen for God's guidance and to follow him with our lives. If we listen for God and God tells us something foolish, and we say, you know what, God, I'd rather not, we need to humble ourselves in that situation, just as Jonathan was willing to say, hey, if they call us up and it makes no sense for us to go to that high point, that means that God is with us. And so I think humility is necessary for us as followers of Jesus in this world today. Okay, next week we're going to continue. Next week, like I said, this story is a little bit more off the beaten path, I think, when it comes to Saul and Jonathan. Next week will be a very familiar story to a lot of us, where we have the story of Saul saving his friend David's life from his father. And so again, next week we'll see some of the differences between Saul and Jonathan. Saul is going to be going about trying to kill David, and Jonathan is going to go about trying to save him. And so we'll read that story together and talk about a couple of things to do with Jonathan and what we can glean from the story and from him and his life. So look forward to that next week. Any final comments or questions before I ask Randy to close us out with a prayer tonight? Yeah.
Well, I also think it's interesting that Saul is going according to his timeline. He waited a day, God didn't answer, that's not in my world, I need an answer. And I don't think it works that way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Listening for God's guidance in our lives, sometimes very frustratingly, can take more time than we want it to, right? I think that's part of that humility also of saying, okay, I'm going to wait for the Lord's voice. Going back to that comment I made at the beginning too, Saul's slow to respond, Jonathan's quick to act, but that doesn't always mean that that's always how God wants us to be. Sometimes we need to be slow to act and wait and listen for the leading of God, the guidance of God. But once we receive it, that's when we need to be quick to follow through with what God has instructed us to do. And so it's the old hurry up and wait. Wait on the Lord, right? Hurry up and wait on him. So good. Okay, anything else? Thank you guys for reading tonight and thinking about this story. Hopefully it's a beneficial one for us to kind of think through, and maybe something we haven't thought about in a little while too, thinking about Jonathan. So Randy, would you close us with prayer?
Let's pray. Father, we thank you for these stories from the Old Testament that reveal yourself to us. And Father, we hope as you reveal yourself to us that we always listen, and we not only listen, but we act on what we hear for you. And Father, we